That's because Dash and Semicolon are on vacation, I suppose. Okay.
That was in New Orleans?
That was, yes. We were there just 2 days. This past summer. But, yeah, okay. So let's have prayer. We will pick up where we left off, and we're dealing with the development of family and the like. And as you read through the book, you can acknowledge that and then start putting in your statements that you have learned or found interesting. So let's pray. Father, we do thank you that you are with us. You're helping us in all of our studies. And in this class, we want to ask you to help us to bring spiritual vitality to people's homes and to help bring strength to each of us and to help as we serve you and to see you as the one who has created family life and then knows how to make this a spiritually vital part of our upbringing, lives, and experience. And we pray that you will bless us this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We were looking here, when we're dealing with affection, attachment, bonds, that they will have all of these different criteria. There's persistence, involvement of one particular person, significant emotional quality to the relationship, maintenance of proximity. I mean, and when we're looking at emotion, sometimes that emotion is not always positive, but nonetheless, it still exists. Feeling of sadness or distress when involuntary separation from one particular person. If a person is supposed to be attached to their mother, and when you take the child away from them, they have no distress whatsoever. They aren't. They're not attached. Now, maybe they shouldn't cry for weeks on end, but nonetheless, they should have a sense of awareness and then a sense of security in place, that they feel safe and secure when they're with mom. And sometimes they will need reassurance of that, or just that mom is around. And, as we get older, people who we're attached to at various levels, we may still have the need to call mom, even if she's 1,000 miles away, when you need something, because that's your go-to person, and that's fine. There are some people who never are able to develop independence enough to be able to move away from proximity, but you can still maintain a sense of attachment. When you are dealing with attachment behavior, behaviorists sometimes have said that infants cry is a random act, and they don't know why they're crying at first. This would be, some psychologists would say, kids don't know why they cry, they just cry for no reason. And then by positive response of the caregiver would provide a reward that encourages more crying. And this is why there was a period where, like, your doctor would tell you, the pediatricians and people would advise, don't rush to your baby every time it cries, because you're just going to cause them to want to cry more. Now, I'm sure there have been some emotionally scarred infants who were in need, whose parents decided not to go to see them because they didn't want to encourage unnecessary crying. So there's a degree of balance here. Children may cry for no reason at times, just because it's, if you need food, you need to change, you're tired, there's only one thing to do. Cry. You can't say, hey, I need help here. This doesn't happen. Therefore, applying conditioning forces in various ways, the child instinct to seek pleasure and avoid pain from the first moments of infancy could mold a child's behavior to almost any desired outcome. And so, behaviorists, there is no need to invest in emotions, insight, or imaginings of the person. Attachment theorists, though, theorize that behaviors such as crying arise out of an instinctive need, not a random accidental behavior, that the child wants to connect with those around it, and primarily the ones who they've already formed a relationship with before they were born. Their mother, definitely, because children are able to hear their mother's voice and know who they are, and can even sense other things about them before they're born. And that's also true of conversations going on around the mother, primarily with the other children and fathers and people who they would already have some connection with. And so they are calling out to them and are hoping for a response. Infant indicates that attachments have developed through the ability to maintain and initiate these kinds of connective behaviors with the people who they wish to maintain these connections with. They also sustain and improve attachments once they are formed. Differential crying develops subsequent to the infant being able to distinguish its mother from other people. And a child does not need to be taught how to use its skills of crying to get what it wants later on, when it can discern differences between people and situations. A child cries differently when it will stop crying when taken by its mother, but it will continue to cry when another person attempts to comfort it. You can tell sometimes a child is crying, and you might hold it, or it might be lying there, and you pick it up, and it continues to cry until its mother takes it. She doesn't have to say anything. He knows, she knows, the baby knows who's holding it, and they now feel satisfied. That has everything to do with an attachment that has already begun before birth. Children begin to recognize when their mother leaves the room and will cry in protest when she leaves the child's field of vision. And if you can't see it, can't see mom, she's not there anymore, and then you might cry. A child will also respond enthusiastically in greeting the mother on their return. Mary Salter Ainsworth did a significant study. This was one of the foundational studies on attachment, in addition to John Bowling. Hers was in 1967, and she did hers in Uganda. Infancy in Uganda, infant care, and the growth of love. There may not necessarily be the degree of over universal principles that might have developed by watching what goes on in the villages in Africa, but nonetheless, it's an interesting study. She includes, the list includes differential crying, differential smiling, differential vocalization, crying when the mother leaves, following the mother, visual motor orientation, greeting through smiling or crawling or general excitement, lifting up arms in greeting, clapping hands in greeting, climbing and scribbling over, scrambling over the mother, burying the face in the mother's lap, approach through any form of movement. the child is capable of doing. Crawling, rooching, that's a good Pennsylvania Dutch word. And
What does that mean, routine?
rooching is just sort of like fidgeting and moving when you're not exactly walking or crawling.
Oh,
A person who can't sit still
yeah.
is rooching. Burying the face in a mother's lap, embracing, hugging, kissing, exploring ways, exploring away from the mother as a secure base. That is interesting. You know, when children are able to walk away from their mother and into another room, and they're expecting mother to stay put. As long as mother is staying put, they are happy. But when they walk back into the room and they realize mother has left, then they become alarmed. And you know, that's the sign that a child is really beginning to explore. Even if they're just walking into the next room, someday they're going to walk into another continent. But if mom's still home, everything's fine. So life goes on. So they're looking for things. The earliest greeting response combines smiling, vocalization, and general bodily excitement. One of the theories is that when a child responds, you know, most mothers can tell you what day their baby smiled back at them first. But most likely the child is not responding because they're happy they saw their mother, but they are just mimicking what the mother does when she sees the child. And they're just being interactive. And because the mother is happy to see the child, so is the baby. Lifting up the arms is reported as part of the greeting response. Greeting response is characterized terminally by crawling to the mother on her return, and the child will scramble over and bury his or her face in the mother's lap and demonstrate attachment in those ways. Often, they will use the mother as a secure base for exploration, as I mentioned. They can do this without anxiety or fear as they become older. They're able to walk away from mom and do so, but often they will stay put. Now, some children necessarily don't have this. I know, like, especially Joy, you know, you had to, with being autistic in the way that she was not aware. She didn't pay attention to where people were. So she could wander off. But you know, a lot of kids won't. You can just walk and you can expect that the child is going to keep track of where you are and stay within so many feet of you as you walk down the street. They may, if you're not careful, stumble into a running car or something. You still have to pay attention to where they are, because they're not paying attention to that, but they are paying attention to where you are. You got to be aware of that. Being a secure base for the child means a parent is being available when ready to respond, when called upon to encourage and perhaps assist, and to intervene actively when when it is clearly necessary. Ainsworth observed that this pattern of attachment would not be recognized as one where it is not for the fact that the child still is concerned about his mother's whereabouts. You would say that they feel safe in their environment. The child is comfortable, leaves the mother figure as long as he or she knows where she is and is able to go somewhere else. A central figure of parenting is that it gives the child the confidence to make these sorties into the outside world and then return. And often they seem proud of themselves when they return, like they made it into the living room all by themselves and came back safely. Flight to the mother when there is as a haven of safety. This is where when a child experiences some kind of fear or other stimulus, or finds him or herself in a strange situation, they will instinctively run back to mom. And this is also important. The child flees to the mother as a safe haven, and they are able to know that they will be accepted, and that indicates that there is a degree of attachment here in that relationship. Now, how do attachments work? Because an attachment can work in various ways. You can have a secure attachment, or anxious, or avoidant. And so a person can be attached to someone with whom they don't like to be around. Or they can be attached to someone who they are constantly afraid. They're just they're ill at ease in that attachment. And they can work in these various ways. Secure attachments effectively use their attachment figures as a haven of safety and a secure place of observation. And we see here that if a person has a secure attachment, they can explore novel environments in the presence of their attachment figures. They don't have a problem going places with them. They're very secure, and they know who they are. They know how they're related. They're not concerned that their attachment with their attachment figure is going to be lost in some way. Become moderately distressed when their attachment figure leaves them briefly. They will express some concern, but they don't go all to pieces. Return to a positive, affective state when they return. There is a ceremony, if you want to call that, a reunification. There may be, a little bit of not hugging. That can be that too. Any kind of things can take place, but you recognize, okay, I've been apart. Now we're together again, and there's a sense of reassurance there. But it's not like the child is inconsolable. And home observations indicate that this pattern occurs in relationships in which the attachment figure shows sensitivity and responsiveness in caregiving. And there is a free and open dialogue, and there is a sense of connection that is real and vital. For anxious infants, infants are characterized by uncertainty about their mother's availability and responsiveness, resulting in being generally anxious and frequently clingy. So, for whatever reason, and it can be for various reasons, but for whatever reasons, they are vigilant in their need to stay with their attachment figure. They become exceedingly distressed when separated. They're both clingy and angry about reunions, often expressing dissatisfaction. They might even strike at their caregiver when they return. There's a sense of disdain. It's not like, I'm glad to see you, Mom. There's a sense like there is almost an angry response at times, or it's overblown with a sense of a need of reassurance and connection. Both observations demonstrate inconsistent, intrusive, or poorly timed care from their primary attachment figures. And although I will say this, that you will find infants that, or children or whatever, that can't be five inches from mom or dad or whatever, and home life seems to be pretty good. But that is something to be in mind. And these are the kinds of people who in all of life have this need to constantly be reassured that everything is okay. in employment, they're constantly needing to be reassured that they aren't going to be let go, or that if there's any kind of issue, they're always on the verge of coming to pieces. In romantic relationships, they constantly need reassurance that, and many times before marriage, they can almost drive the person who's with them in this relationship crazy enough that they are rejected, because they're constantly needing reassurance that they are loved, appreciated, connected with, and when they aren't satisfied, they respond in an angry sort of way because they don't know how to really connect and attach. That could be a problem. They could also, with God, they're never confident that they're right with God either. They're always on unsure of themselves. They're constantly in need of reassurance of their connection. They can't ever get settled. And that can also be a problem. Now, avoidant issues, infants behave as if they are indifferent to separation in the strange situation, displaying little effects of secure or secure-based behavior. And you have to admit that they do this, like the studies where they take a child and they put they have the child here in the room, and then they have with their mother, and then they have someone come in and take the child away and see what happens. And then analyze that. So anyway, that inflicting abuse, trauma on the child, but that's how they do this. Okay, explore novel environments, though perhaps not as creatively as the secure environment child. They just wander around and they don't seem to have any sense of security when they're with mom, and when they leave, they're not really leaving with a purpose of confidence. They're just sort of wandering. Outwardly do not appear upset when their attachment figure leaves. They may not even seem to notice. Upon reunion, show little joyful response that mom is there. They actively turn away from their attachment figures and can just wander off. And home observations indicate the primary caregivers are uncomfortable with close bodily contact and unlikely to respond warmly if the infant exhibits neediness or distress. And often, mothers may not have an instinctive nature of connecting, but if a mother was not so sure what to do, because her relationship with her mother was not good, this can be a problem. A lot of times men, especially in the past, were instructed growing up, don't show your emotions, and it's hard for them to say what they're feeling, even when they want to, and that could create issues that are multi-generational in creating family dynamics. The working model of attachment developed in the first years of a childhood will determine how the person approaches future relationships. Now, I'm not going to say that if you know someone who seems to have avoidant characteristics or anxious characteristics that you're doomed. You're doomed to struggle all of your life, but there's going to be residual effects on how we, and every family is a combination of these things. And the families that we minister to, and even in our own families, the people we marry, the people who we come into contact with, are going to be affected in these ways by life. And so you don't necessarily have to say, okay, Rach, you don't have to say, Seth, I know you're an anxiously attached person, and so as a result, I learned that today in class, and you could fit all the characteristics, and now I know what your problems are. That's not necessarily the case, but what you could say is this: I need to be aware that behavior is rooted in things that sometimes the person doesn't have control over. When you're 1 year old, you're not deciding how you're going to respond to stimuli. But you still are, and it has legacy impacts on our lives.
Dr. E,
Yeah.
going back to anxious infants, I think you've talked about this. I've been trying to find it in Principles and Methods of Spiritual Formation, where you talked about the different believers and their path, right? And does this play effect in that?
It does have an effect in that. Because there are people who are, you know, as I mentioned, even like in discipleship, and those of you who are in there, but, you know, there are people who are stable Christians. There are people who are constantly struggling. And it can have to do with the way that they form attachments. It's hard for a person who is anxiously attached to mom and dad and other primary caregivers to become securely attached to God. They're likely to be anxiously attached. And as a result, they're constantly struggling. They're constantly in flux. They're constantly worried they're not doing good enough because they never were sure that they ever really pleased mom or dad. Or they're not really sure that they pleased their professors in school. And were interpreted that. And dad could say, I just wanted, you know, I was just wanted everyone, all my kids to do their very best, but they found it hard. They were never told, I appreciate you by their parents. They find it hard to acknowledge that all they can see is how they don't measure up to some standard of perfection they wish they had. That can be a problem, yeah.
One more, would the same go for secure infants? So, for example, could there be a scenario where security as an infant and security through your relationship even with your parents would give like a naiveness in your relationship with God?
It can, but it can also allow you the ability to make an attachment and then live it out with confidence that develops real spiritual depth. Mrs. Fisher said that when she came here to start teaching, she was raised Presbyterian, that she'd never heard of anyone saying that they had ever backslid in their life. That was not part of her thinking. This idea that there were people who were saved and now they're not sure if they are anymore, you know, they did something. Students were always up and down, in and out, over and out, you know, whatever the case may be. And she thought, she was glad that as a young person, she never experienced that, because in her mind, you just got saved, or you were a Christian, and you just lived it. And you worked through those issues without worrying about whether or not you were actually saved or not constantly. Because if you're constantly worried there, you can't ever build a foundation. Now, it is also true that when she would say that when she got here and she was first hearing about the idea of entire sanctification and she prayed for that, she later would say that that's when she really and fully committed herself to God, and then was later on actually sanctified. That she had to make a commitment that was more than just a naive belief that I, you know, just grew up in a Presbyterian home and I always knew it, and I took communion and so forth. I had to really be committed to this. And then later on, she was sanctified. So God will lead us, but yes. But there are people who don't have as great an experience of conversion, because the idea of transferring their sense of commitment to mom and dad and other things to God and just merging into the spiritual life is very natural. Some people won't have a very big commitment. Other people, they're compensating for what they didn't have in other areas. And so their conversion experience will be much more dramatic. So not everyone has to have the most dramatic conversion experience for it to be true and real. Transitions in attachment. When a child becomes an adolescent and engages their peers in relationship, maybe sometime between 8 and 14, that peer relations begin to take precedence over parents as source of comfort and emotional support. And many times parents, especially the primary attached parent, which is often mom, has trouble with this when this begins to occur. I mean, they never really anticipated that they had children to launch them into the world as independent beings. I don't know what they thought they were having them for, but if they're really appropriately attached to mom and dad, kids will come home. Kids will come home and they will still be in contact. A parent's attachment to adolescent children is more goal correcting as the adolescent gains communication and perspective on taking on skills. So if you have a good attachment with your children when they're young, as they get older and they begin to move out into the world, you can help them create good goals and abilities to have a great life in the outside world. Otherwise, if you're just trying to control them and keep them in a box that you want your good little child to be in, that's eventually going to fail. And then there's going to be family crisis that develops as a result. Both parent and teen can correct their attachment-related behavior to meet the changing attachment needs. Transformation of children into self-sufficient adults during adolescence is not an end in itself. This transformation encourages the development of long-term romantic attachments, and it also is the time when a child will become, hopefully if they're Christians, attached to God in a way that will become more dominant than their attachment to parents. Even Jesus commended that. You know, someday you have to be more attached to me than you are to anything else. And so that can create trauma in the home if that attachment creates dynamics that the parents are not anticipating. Attachments to the adolescent. Attachment to the adolescent's mother wanes in relation to his or her attachment to peers. By late adolescence, full-blown attachments are formed with peers, in some cases where they are perceived as more primary than the initial one. Romantic attachments, and in this case, I'm not necessarily dealing with relationships with God, but primary romantic attachments will take prominence. On an interview of 100 adults ranging from the age of 18 to 82, that's a good range, found that those participating in committed romantic relationships for more than 2 years are clearly peer-oriented in both proximity-seeking and safe haven behaviors. Therefore, romantic pair bonds that survive for longer than 2 years begin to qualify as a bona fide attachment and are rooted in the need for human species for survival and ensure that infants are cared for in a suitable relationship. So it does take a while for relationships to really create a bond that is going to be seen as an attachment. This can happen during the dating process, but clearly while a person is married, when President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, was born, his mother put all of her energy into raising him, including no longer even sleeping in a sexual relationship with her own husband. She just poured everything into this one child. And she thought she knew every waking thought that Franklin had, except for one, that he had hid from her. That he had met a young lady who was the niece of the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, at a family reunion. but who was far enoughly not related that he could secretly write to her. So she didn't change her maiden name when she became a Roosevelt. Her maiden name was Roosevelt too. What a shock it was to his mother to find out that he was going to get married. She thought she knew everything about Franklin, and now they're getting married. When they're out on their honeymoon, by this time, her husband has died. She's a widow. She builds a house for them as a wedding present in New York City, a row home, and next to it, she builds a house for her. And she puts sliding doors on every floor so she can go into their house anytime she wants on any level. And even after the children were born, and Mrs. Roosevelt was very much, Eleanor was not comfortable around kids. She was an only child and raised in boarding schools, even as an infant, young child growing up. Her father was in mental asylums and so forth. And anyway, her upbringing was just a disaster. She was really afraid of kids, and she had plenty of them. And that grandmother would tell these kids, I'm really your mother. She just bore you. That is not a good, healthy relationship at any level. So he was really incapable of being independent. In fact, he didn't have control of his money. He lived on an allowance from the family estate until 1942. He's in his third term as president before he gets control of his money, because his mother controlled it his whole life. Sexual attraction is important, brings about these bonds, activates an attachment behavior system. Each person sees the other as an attachment figure. In a romantic relationship, the husband and the wife are both attached to the other and see the other person as an attachment figure, mutually working to maintain the attachment bond. A peer relationship with one another, not necessarily perceived as consistently stronger or wiser or changing in one way or another. Now, family life in America has changed, and some of this material that I have in here has changed some even in the past several years. Things are certainly in flux when it comes to family life in the United States. There was a day when premarital cohabitation was not seen as, was certainly frowned upon. And today, living together, I don't know if that's something that is significantly done. People are just so lax about whatever their situation is, but things really began to change in the 1970s and then into the 1980s. Reason for cohabitation: you can know a person better when you live together, sort of on a rent-to-own basis. Now, there is no doubt that the statistics on marital stability do not bear out that top thing is true. Couples that live together prior to marriage have less durable marriages than those who do not. Viewed as a test for compatibility, and afterward you are if you try this out and so forth, then you're seeing whether or not this is something that you want to take on as a permanent fixture. Gives opportunity to avoid getting trapped in an unhappy marriage. That may be true, but I don't know that. I'm sure the statistics show that people are just as likely to get trapped in an unhappy marriage after they've lived together. Because often if a person is living with someone, maybe they'll never get married, but they have a series of these relationships, then eventually crisis happens and they want more stability and they'll marry someone that was not very wise. Financial reason to avoid paying for a marriage. A person could live together and then they have financial needs. Oh, they need to get married and weddings cost money, but they can use that money to pay off their student loans or to buy a house or to do this or that. And marriage just becomes less and less of a priority. Couples are less satisfied in their relationship because the relationship does have a sense of insecurity to it. And yet, there are interesting things. I have a relative, a cousin and a half or something, that was living with a lady, and then they had a child, and then they got married, and then they got divorced, and then they started living together again and had another child. They seemed to be happier when they weren't living together. Somewhere in either one of them, there is an inability to be able to deal with the issues that arise from obligation within a relationship. And that needs to be dealt with. I found that to be extremely interesting, that they lived together and then they got divorced and they were both living with other people for a while, and then they got back together and they lived together, but they weren't married. They were never married to anyone else in between. That was a rather interesting dilemma to find oneself in. Inherent dangers in living together: loss of self-esteem when a partner leaves, and that often does occur. Tendency to drop out of marriage quicker after one is married. There's a higher rate of depression that is associated with cohabitation, and higher rates of physical and sexual abuse, which I find extremely interesting, that there are people who will accept cohabitation with someone who is abusing them and they won't leave. They will stay in that, feeling trapped in some other way. This has truly taken on whole new dynamics in recent years, has increased significantly in recent years. 700,000 couples, that's small. I mean, gay couples are everywhere. And now that it is legal in all 50 states, and it is promoted as normal and universally applicable. Before the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it was said that 2.5% of the military was gay, but they weren't able to express themselves. I do think that rule was wrong, because one of the main characteristics of the military is to be honest. And here you were telling them to be dishonest about this, either let them in or not. 7,400 companies offer equal benefits for same-sex partners. That is not as much true today, because now marital relationships are possible. Because many of these companies, prior to the national change in the whole idea of gay marriage, many of these companies would not have given, let's say, health insurance benefits to a heterosexual couple that was cohabitating as part of the family plan that they offered, but they would a gay couple because they didn't have the option of marrying. So I would imagine that there may be some adjustment there. With the legalization of same-sex unions, this will become a growing issue for the church, and it is something that we need to deal with, how we handle the real dilemma, and it's not just, we've had some good conferences on this, but the mechanics of dealing with the idea that people who are married in a same-sex relationship and they get saved, and only one of the person gets saved, you've got some legal things to untangle. And you might have finances together, you might have property together, you might even have adopted children together, and that's something you're gonna have to deal with those people will have to deal with for the rest of their lives. And how that is done needs to take wisdom. Single parent families. Early American culture, there were few single parent families. Probably about 3% of the adult population, and that was usually because of some kind of death, tragedy. Society frowned on breaking of this foundation, and there just was not much in this area of divorce. I read a book one time that was based on the very first, it's a novel, but it's based on an actual story about the very first divorce in Kentucky. And it had to do with Shakerism. When Shakers came into Kentucky, there was a situation where, if you know anything about Shakers, they didn't believe in having any type of sexual relationship, even between married couples, and as a result of that, there was this couple that when Shakers came into this area, they were they joined up, and the wife wanted to leave, but the husband was very committed to Shakerism, and eventually she was able to get a divorce and leave. So that was the situation that she was in. I'm gonna have to check and see what the issue is here. I may have to put it over here on another day. The church certainly did not support divorce, and often the threat of social stigma kept people in relationships that otherwise they wouldn't have been in. And there was a degree of marital distress that was just seen as expected. Agrarian economy culture prevented separation, partly because people were economically tied to the idea of family as a business. You were just, survival was the case. I remember one time listening to an interview by Loretta Lynn, who was married to her husband, 60 years or something, and she married him when she was 12. And she said in some of those early days, she would have left him if she could, because she had reason to, but she was in such a poverty situation, isolated situation, that all she could do for weeks or months at a time while he was off drinking or working for the railroad or whatever, just go out and hunt enough berries, dig up a few roots to make sure you and the kids don't starve. There was no, if she would have been in a situation where she could have ran away, she would have, but she couldn't. Life did get better eventually, but that was an issue. In the 1960s, single-parent households increased with the stigma about being divorced being lessened, and that continued to grow. And then remarriage after divorce, or like the Brady Bunch. We're not actually sure why they were didn't have spouses. Growing because of the rise of the divorce rate, even among evangelicals. 65% of remarriages include children from previous relationships. The church needs to identify the need for step families. Did parents pass away, or did the family have a divorce? Was there abuse in the relationship? Are there unpacked emotional issues from abandonment? And all of these things need to be brought into the whole structure of family dynamics. And one of the things that we'll deal with in the second half of the course is helping hurting families heal. That's important for us for spiritual development. What is the role that members of the blended family